This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine. Early November 28th, I just want to remind people I am in Bangkok, Thailand, +7 GMT. So when you're watching this, it's probably still going to be the 27th, wherever you are. If you're watching this right as I upload it, I have not done an update on Russian military operations in Ukraine for a couple of days. My apologies. If you do want excellent, in-depth, and daily updates on the situation in Ukraine, I highly recommend the channels of Alexander Mikuris and Alex Christoforou, both of the Duran. I will put the links to their channels in my video description. Check them out and you will get daily in-depth updates, and they also cover a whole range of other geopolitical issues. Let me get right into this update. Let's start by looking at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is extremely pro-Ukrainian, so keep that in mind when we're looking at it. You can see there are missile attacks being reported across part of the country. And if we look at the front line, we see that it's more or less stable. Whatever these two massive offensives were that Ukraine had launched, they have long since grounded to a halt. You see these red rifle icons. Anytime you see these red rifle icons outside of Russian held territory indicated by red, that means that even this pro-Ukrainian map is admitting that Russian forces are on the offensive, and they are on the offensive all across the Donbas region and up along this boundary between Kharkov and Lugansk. That does not mean that Ukraine is not preparing additional offensives. There are reports that they are building up troops around Izium and aimed at northern Lugansk, and also preparing an offensive aimed at Zaporozhye and Melitopol. So today there are missile attacks being reported across Ukraine, and there have been several major missile attacks by Russia against Ukrainian infrastructure since my last update. Several major salvos have been launched, and they continue degrading Ukraine's power grid. So let's look at this BBC article. This is just a day ago. Ukraine war, 6 million without power as winter bites. And it says Ukraine's president says 6 million Ukrainian households are still without power after massive missile strikes hit the country this week. As of this evening, blackouts continue in most regions and in Kiev. Vladimir Zelensky said in his nightly address, the number of affected households has reduced by half since Wednesday, he added, but millions have been left without light, water, or heat as winter sets in. And the BBC also claims Ukraine and its Western allies have repeatedly said that by targeting critical civilian infrastructure, Russia is committing war crimes, an accusation denied by Moscow. Well, now, if that is true, if Russia is committing a war crime by targeting Ukraine's power grid, then the collective West is guilty of multiple war crimes, because every time they launch a war of aggression against another nation, the first thing they do is attack the power grid. And this is an article from the Washington Post, 1999, NATO warplanes Jolt Yugoslav power grid. Okay, just listen very carefully to this 1999 Washington Post article. NATO airstrikes on Yugoslavia's power grid left millions of people without electricity or water service today, bringing the war over Kosovo more directly into the lives of civilians across the country. So you expect the Washington Post to explain how this is a war crime, right? Wrong. Officials at the Pentagon and at NATO headquarters in Belgium said Allied jets deliberately attacked the power grid, aiming to shut it down more completely and for longer periods than at any time previously in the 2-month-old air campaign. U.S. officials estimated the attacks had shut off power to about 80% of Serbia. Allied officials said the attacks were intended to disrupt operations by the Serb-led Yugoslav military in Kosovo, the focus of the conflict, and not target civilians. But by increasing the hardship of ordinary citizens, alliance leaders also appeared to be seeking to encourage public dissatisfaction with the government of Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic. And I've also gone over in previous updates how the US did the exact same thing in Iraq. So what is this hypocritical, empty bloviating from across the West about Russia committing war crimes when this is something the West has repeatedly done? What is this all about? This is about them being completely helpless and unable to stop Russia from continuing to target Ukraine's infrastructure. They cannot stop Russia. There's nothing in their inventories that they can transfer to Ukraine to stop Russia. And there's nothing they can do to create an alternative supply of energy for Ukraine. And there's absolutely nothing they can do to repair the infrastructure. They're completely helpless. Now, there is one thing that they could do, actually, to stop all of this. They could tell Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. The United States and the rest of NATO deliberately created a national security threat right on Russia's border, which is more than you can say about all of the nations the US invaded and attacked the critical infrastructure of, nations like Yugoslavia or Iraq or Libya or Syria. These are all countries thousands of miles away from the United States, separated by continents and oceans. They never posed a threat to the United States. Ukraine, with NATO forces training Ukrainians, arming Ukrainians, and deliberately creating a national security threat directly on Russia's border, that was a threat to Russia. And it's a threat Russia is going to eliminate one way or the other. And it's up to Ukraine's Western sponsors how that threat is eliminated, either through negotiations and diplomacy or by systematically dismantling the country, including its infrastructure. That decision is entirely Washington's, not Moscow's. Now, despite growing evidence of Ukraine's deterioration and the West's inability to stop it, or the West's inability to aid Ukraine in this proxy conflict between NATO and Russia, we still see from certain corners in the Western media them attempting to claim that everything is going very well for Ukraine and everything is coming apart for Russia. So the first story I want to talk about is this one from The Guardian. I saw this today. And it's titled, "Russia Firing Aging Cruise Missiles Because Stocks Are Depleted. Ministry of Defense Suggests," and this is the British Ministry of Defense, and this is what the Guardian says. "Russia is firing aging cruise missiles stripped of their nuclear warheads at Ukrainian targets because Vladimir Putin's stocks are so depleted," the Ministry of Defense has suggested. An intelligence update from the British Ministry of Defense on Saturday said the desperate improvisation by the Russian president's struggling forces are unlikely to achieve reliable effects. The evidence cited is pictures of apparently shot down AS-15 Kent air-launched cruise missiles, which are said to have been designed in the 1980s as a nuclear delivery system. The Ministry of Defense said the nuclear warheads had probably been substituted for ballast, with the Kremlin's hope probably that the missiles will distract Ukrainian air defenses. So they're firing these to distract the air defense system. That's the first claim. Although such an inert system will still produce some damage through the missile's kinetic energy and any unspent fuel, it is unlikely to achieve reliable effects against intended targets, a statement said. Whatever Russia's intent, this improvisation highlights the level of depletion in Russia's stock of long-range missiles. This makes absolutely no sense, because they're either using them as decoys or they're using them because they are out of their newer cruise missiles. And they're using these older ones in place of the cruise missiles they have been using all along. If you were really running out of cruise missiles, you would not strip a cruise missile of its warhead and replace it with inert ballast. You would replace it with a conventional warhead. So it's very obvious that if this story is even true, Russia is using these old cruise missiles that they're not using anymore for anything else. They're using them as decoys to possibly do two things: to expend Ukrainian air defense munitions, which are not unlimited, or to force Ukraine to turn on their radar so Russia can see where they are. They also have anti-radar missiles that they can use to strike at and destroy elements of Ukrainian air defense systems. Now, the worst part about this lie being told by the British Ministry of Defense, and the British Ministry of Defense can be accused of many things, but being honest is not one of them. It is a well-established practice to use decoys in this very way as a way of forcing an enemy to switch on their radars so that you can see where they are, so that you could work around their systems or you can target their systems. Here's an article, a little bit more honest article than The Guardian, from The Drive, The War Zone. Is Russia now firing denuclearized cruise missiles at Ukraine? And it says, repurposing old nuclear cruise missiles as decoys to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses could make sense. And yes, it does. It makes a lot of sense. The article admits that the evidence cited by the British Ministry of Defense is hardly conclusive, and it also explains how these older missiles were probably going to be scrapped, and instead of just scrapping them, Russia decided to put them to one last good use. Now, I want to show you how even the US military has used this very same tactic and has used it to good effect in the past, in past military operations. This is a blog called Arms Control Wonk, Scathe Mean in Desert Storm. This is from 2015. The article says, did you know the United States deployed a ground-launched cruise missile unit in Saudi Arabia, but instead of being equipped with nuclear-armed BGM-109G Griffin, the unit deployed the Navy BQM-74 drones that were used to spoof the radars associated with Iraq's air defenses. The operation, known as Scathe Mean, is a really interesting tale. So the BQM-74, it's a lot like this cruise missile the UK Ministry of Defense is talking about Russia using. It doesn't have a warhead. It's used for target practice. So they were flying these over Iraq. Iraq thought they were actual cruise missiles. They flipped on their air defense radars. The US could see them. When they flipped on their radars and were trying to target these cruise missiles, aircraft were following behind with anti-radar missiles to target and destroy Iraq's air defenses. And that's actually what it says. The short version is that the Air Force wanted to send a wave of target drones into Iraq to fool the Iraqis into turning on their radars, with a large number of strike aircraft following to turn them back off permanently. What they mean is destroy them. The article also says, as it turns out, the Air Force was in the process of decommissioning these units to meet its obligations under the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Those units represented the right pool of skills for the mission. The US was in the middle, standing down these units. So just like these old cruise missiles the Russians have that they weren't going to use and were eventually going to have to scrap, the US put these target drones to good use one last time before decommissioning them, which backs up what this most recent article from The Drive said. And apparently the operation was very successful. So the article says, the ruse worked perfectly. The damage to the Iraqi air defense network in the first few days was sufficient that, according to Aviation Week and Space Technology, the Iraqis simply resorted to shooting their missiles without turning on radar when Allied aircraft were in the area, which is a less than ideal tactic when faced with enemy air attacks. So it's very obvious this is a much better explanation for why a cruise missile with an inert warhead would be found in Ukraine, if it was even found in Ukraine. And it's a much more compelling explanation than what the UK has been claiming for months now, that actually Russia is out of cruise missiles. Well, they've been saying this for months now, for half a year actually, and it's very obviously not true. Now there's another attempt to convince us all that everything is going great for Ukraine and its Western sponsors, and Russian resistance is futile. So this was pointed out to me by an audience member, and it's an article published by the Center for European Policy Analysis. Now, CEPA is funded by some of the largest weapons manufacturers in the West, and it's also funded by the US State Department. So it's a government and arms industry funded think tank, And the article is called, "It's Costing Peanuts for the US to Defeat Russia." And this is what it claims. The Ukrainian armed forces have already killed or wounded upwards to 100,000 Russian troops, half of its original fighting force. There have been almost 8,000 confirmed losses of armored vehicles, including thousands of tanks, thousands of APCs, artillery pieces, hundreds of fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft, and numerous naval vessels. And when you're reading the article and you check the sources, all of this open source intelligence nonsense that is pure propaganda, war propaganda, that doesn't even come close to touching reality. And I'll get into the casualty numbers here in just a minute. Let's read on. U.S. spending of 5.6% of its defense budget to destroy nearly half of Russia's conventional military capability seems like an absolutely incredible investment. If we divide out the U.S. defense budget to the threats it faces, Russia would perhaps be of the order of 100 to 150 billion in spend to threat. So spending just 40 billion a year erodes a threat value of 100 to 150 billion, a 2 to 3 time return. Actually, the return is likely to be multiples of this given the defense spending and threat are annual recurring events. So they're claiming that the US is spending 5.6% of its defense budget to destroy 50% or more of Russia's military capability, but that is obviously not true. They're not doing that. They haven't killed 100,000 Russian soldiers, not even close. So let's dig into the casualty numbers. This claim that Ukraine has killed over 100,000 Russian soldiers. Here is Meduza. It's a US government-funded propaganda outlet spreading anti-Kremlin propaganda. And the title is "Tallying the Troops. BBC journalists identify more than 3,000 Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine." And this was published at the very end of May 2022. And the source is BBC News Russia. So they're saying 3,000 Russian troops killed in 3 months. That was at the very beginning of the conflict. That was when Russia plunged its troops right into the middle of Kiev and northern and northeastern Ukraine. And they were essentially surrounded by Ukrainian troops. And that's when they were taking their heaviest losses. And the BBC is estimating that Russia was losing about 1,000 troops per month for 3 months. So that's how they got 3,000. So now we're at the end of November. So it's about 9 months. And let's assume Russia continued to lose 1,000 troops every single month, which they aren't. They're losing far fewer than that now. That would add up to only 9,000. Only 9,000. That's a far, far smaller number than 100,000. 10 times smaller than 100,000. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense puts the number, this was a recent claim, at around 6,000. And this is actually much more realistic than 9,000 and much more realistic than 100,000. It's because, again, Russia took heavy losses in the beginning because of their high risk, high payoff, but low probability of success strategy of trying to shock Ukraine into surrendering in the opening phase of the conflict. It didn't work. So they shifted to a war of attrition, long-range fires from well-prepared defenses against Ukrainians who are outgunned and being outfought. Obviously, they're going to lose far fewer soldiers fighting the conflict that way than when they began the conflict. So actually, let's just use the 9,000 number. Let's just pretend that the BBC was right and Russia continued losing that many troops all the way up until now. So they lost a total of 9,000 troops. That means the US is actually paying 5.6% of its defense budget to destroy only 4.5% of Russia's conventional military capability. And this is going by their extremely warped calculus. If we use 6,000, which is actually the much more realistic number, that means the US is spending 5.6% of its defense budget to destroy only 3% of Russia's conventional military capability. Again, going off of SIPA's very flawed mathematics. But then you have to remember that Russia is not committing 100% of its military capabilities to this conflict in Ukraine, not even close. And now they've mobilized 300,000 extra reservists, and they're bringing them in. So then the number drops even further to somewhere around 2%. Now, you saw who was funding SIPA, the arms industry, and they're going to make money whether Ukraine exists or not in 6 months or a year's time. They're still going to make their money on their long-term contracts to backfill weapons that are being sent to Ukraine now. So they want to keep this going for as long as possible and for as long as profitable, no matter how unlikely it is that Ukraine is going to succeed. And of course, their Western backers, how unlikely it is they're going to succeed. I also want to point out that in their equation, they never factored in Ukraine's losses because they couldn't care less about dead Ukrainians or what Ukraine is losing economically and now in terms of their infrastructure disappearing. They couldn't care less about that. That never even factored into the equation. So you can see what their actual true motivations are. Waging this proxy war against Russia has nothing to do with Ukraine. Ukraine is expendable. Now, the SIPA article continues. It says, the U.S. military might reasonably wish Russia to continue deploying military forces for Ukraine to destroy. But we already know that it's not happening nearly at the rate they claim. It also says, meanwhile, replacing destroyed kit and keeping up with the new arms race that it has now triggered with the West will surely end up bankrupting the Russian economy, especially an economy subject to aggressive Western sanctions. How can Russia possibly hope to win an arms race when the combined GDP of the West is 40 trillion and its defense spending amounting to 2% of GDP totals, well in excess of 1 trillion? When the disproportionate U.S. defense contribution is considered, Russia's total GDP is only 1.8 trillion. Vladimir Putin will have to divert spending from consumption to defense, risking social and political unrest over the medium term and a real and soon-to-be present danger to his regime. Just imagine how much more of a bargain Western military aid will be if it ultimately brings positive regime change in Russia. Well, it's very clear that these sanctions are hurting Europe more than they're hurting Russia. It's also very clear that SIPA is using extremely flawed metrics. You cannot just look at a nation's GDP and then determine the strength of its military industrial output. You actually have to look at military industrial output, because if your GDP is inflated because you play games with numbers and ledgers like the entire West does, that doesn't give you an actual reflection of your military industrial output or your industrial output in general. And Russia, despite its much smaller GDP, has a disproportionately large industrial output in general and a very large military industrial output. So this is a very flawed metric that makes absolutely no sense. And we could just look at what's going on. So we see Russia sending new tanks, new aircraft, new drones to the battlefield, and we're watching the U.S. scrounge around for T-72s to refurbish and send to Ukraine, and even T-55s, which is a post-World War II designed tank. They're taking these tanks and sending them to Ukraine because they have nothing else to send them. So obviously, GDP does not reflect a military industrial capacity. It simply does not. It's self-evident in what the U.S. is actually sending to Ukraine. Let's take a look at one of these U.S. Department of Defense aid packages. So this was November 23rd, $400 million in additional assistance for Ukraine. And here is a list. And let's go over the list and let's ask ourselves if this sounds like a West with a sustainable military industrial output and an unending supply of weapons that it can send to Ukraine versus Russia. So the first item is additional munitions for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, NASAMS. And again, they have maybe 2 of these systems in Ukraine. They have a limited range compared to the S-300, so they're either in 1 or 2 different locations, and that's it. And then the rest of Ukraine is vulnerable to attack. They can only fire 6 missiles at a time. Now, in terms of ammunition, in theory, they should have enough because it's using a standard air-to-air missile as its munition. It is a ground system that fires air-to-air missiles. So they should be okay in terms of missiles. But even if they have enough missiles, they simply don't have enough launchers for them, and they're not going to. They're not going to have enough launchers for many years, and that is if the systems that have been sent to Ukraine now last long enough to be joined by other systems next year and then years later. The next item is 150 machine guns with thermal imagery sights to counter unmanned aerial systems. So there are 150 machine guns. This is what Ukraine is supposed to use to cover all of their airspace. Utterly absurd. I mean, it's one of the largest nations in Europe. 150 machine guns, that's all they're getting. Additional ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS. So we're not seeing any numbers at all in terms of the ammunition that's being sent or the type of ammunition, but we have heard that the US is sending M30A1 rockets. These are actually anti-personnel rockets, and I have seen evidence that Ukraine is using these on buildings, which means they are running out of standard rockets that are actually designed to hit structures, fortified positions, and they're using anti-personnel rockets instead, which still do a lot of damage, but it's an illustration of how the US is running out of munitions to send Ukraine, even for something like HIMARS. 200 precision-guided 155 millimeter artillery rounds. These are the GPS-guided Excalibur rounds. And we've heard Ukraine fires something like 6,000 rounds of artillery a day. And we hear that an Excalibur round, because it's a precision-guided munition, is as good as 10 to 50 standard rounds. So let's just say one Excalibur round is as good as, say, 50 standard rounds. The US is sending them 200, so that's equivalent to 10,000 standard 155 millimeter rounds. And if Ukraine is firing 6,000 rounds a day, that's less than 2 days worth, isn't it? And by the way, 200 155 millimeter Excalibur rounds, this package, the previous package, had 500, so it went from 500 to 200. Are we expected to believe that Ukraine doesn't need more of these? They actually need less of these. I'm not buying it. 10,000 120 millimeter mortar rounds, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARMs. These are the anti-radar missiles that we kept hearing about. And I've not seen any evidence at all that they're making any difference on the battlefield. All I have actually seen these hit are empty fields and residential buildings because they missed their target. 150 high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, Humvees. So they keep sending 100, 150, 200 Humvees per package, but these are glorified SUVs. Ukraine needs tanks. They need armored personnel carriers. They need infantry fighting vehicles. They do not need Hummers, but that's all the US has to send them. So that's all they're getting, is not a substitute for these more heavily armored vehicles that Ukraine absolutely needs and is not getting. In addition to these 150 Humvees, they're getting over 100 light tactical vehicles, and they provide no details, but it sounds like they're talking about just pickup trucks, you know, like the pickup trucks the US and its allies were sending ISIS in Syria. Over 20 million rounds of small arms ammunition. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 20 million rounds of small arms ammunition. But I want to remind people that a soldier is going to be loaded out with about 210 rounds. And that's not even going to last you through a moderate length firefight. So 20 million rounds, maybe that's good enough for a single brigade of about 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers for about a month of fighting. That's what that's good for. It's not as much as it sounds. Soldiers on a modern battlefield go through huge amounts of small arms ammunition. If you see them fighting, it's not one shot, one kill. They are spraying bullets everywhere. The vast majority of them do not hit their targets. It's suppressive fire, while other groups try to maneuver into an advantageous position to either push the enemy away or to destroy them eventually. And then it says over 200 generators. This is a whole country that is out of power. So 200 generators for who? For what? What good is this going to do? And then it says spare parts for 105 millimeter howitzers and other equipment. Notice they're talking about the much smaller and shorter range 105 millimeter howitzer, and not 155 millimeter howitzers like the M777 or some of the other howitzers NATO members have been sending Ukraine. And I'll talk about howitzers a little more here in a moment. The US certainly can outspend Russia. They literally print their money. That's not the problem. You can have all the money in the world, but if you have nothing to actually buy with that money, then it becomes a problem. And when you're fighting a war, you're talking about tangible hardware, weapons, equipment, munitions. These are things that have to be produced, that you use your money to buy. And if they don't exist, all of the money in the world isn't going to help you. Now, finally, here's the sales pitch. It says, second, the war has served to destroy the myth that Russian military technology is somehow comparable to that of the US and West. Remember that Ukraine is using only upgraded second-generation US technology, but is consistently beating whatever Russia's military can deploy. Wars are shop windows for defense manufacturers. Any buyer in their right mind will want the technology made by the winner. Putin's misjudgment has merely provided a fantastic marketing opportunity for its Western competitors and the financial sponsors of this article. But when you really think about it, when you actually look at what's going on, that's not true, is it? It's not true that the Ukrainians are beating whatever Russia's military can deploy. That's simply not true. How does SIPA reconcile that claim with the fact that the US doesn't even want to send Gray Eagle drones to Ukraine because they know Russia will shoot them out of the sky? And they're also worried that because they'll be shot down, Russia will get their hands on US technology. So they're not even going to send them to the conflict because they know they're inappropriate for the conflict. Or how about this? I've been talking about this for a very long time. From the New York Times, artillery is breaking in Ukraine. It's becoming a problem for the Pentagon. Ukrainian soldiers are firing thousands of shells daily, forcing the US to replace gun barrels across the border in Poland. And just look at a map. If Ukraine is fighting on the front line in the Donbas and a gun goes down, they have to go 1,000 kilometers to the border with Poland to get it fixed, and then another 1,000 kilometers back to rejoin the fight. Just think about that. The article says Ukrainian troops fire thousands of explosive shells at Russian targets every day using high-tech cannons supplied by the United States and its allies. But those weapons are burning out after months of overuse or being damaged or destroyed in combat. And dozens have been taken off the battlefield for repairs, according to US and Ukrainian officials. A third of the roughly 350 Western-made howitzers donated to Kiev are out of action at any given time. According to US defense officials and others familiar with Ukraine's defense needs, swapping out a howitzer's barrel, which can be 20 feet long and weigh thousands of pounds, is beyond the capability of soldiers in the field and has become a priority for the Pentagon's European Command, which has set up a repair facility in Poland, again, 1,000 kilometers away from the front line. And I said this was going to happen. You hand weapons over to a military that is unfamiliar with them and has no ability to repair them. This is going to become a central and constant problem that you're not going to be able to rectify. It will take years to integrate new weapons into a military and give them the capability to not only use them most effectively, but also to repair them and keep them in the fight. And this is something that simply cannot happen. It requires years of time to do under the best of conditions. The New York Times also says after the damaged howitzers arrive in Poland, maintenance crews can change out the barrels and make other repairs. Ukrainian officials have said they would like to bring those maintenance sites closer to the front line so that the guns can be returned to combat sooner, the US officials and other people said. Well, you could try, but as soon as you move it into Ukrainian territory, Russia is just going to blow it up. And they have been blowing up maintenance facilities all over the country, which is why they're in Poland in the first place. So you want it, but it's unrealistic to want it, and it's never going to happen. And here's another thing that I've said since the beginning. Since I heard that the US was thinking about sending M777s to Ukraine, this is a weapon system designed for US small wars, for fighting developing countries without standing armies. It was never designed to fight the Russian military. And now here's the New York Times months, almost a year later, finally admitting this. So it says, currently, Ukrainian forces are firing 2,000 to 4,000 artillery shells a day, a number frequently outmatched by the Russians. So they're admitting that the Russians outgun them. And that directly contradicts what that SIPA article was claiming. Over time, that pace has caused problems for Ukrainian soldiers using M777 howitzers, such as shells not traveling as far or as accurately. Some of the issues can be traced in part to the howitzer's design. Built largely with titanium, which is lighter than steel but is just as strong, the weapon is easier to move on the battlefield and quicker to set up than earlier guns, a clear advantage for the United States when it began using the M777 in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s. In those wars, unlike in Ukraine, the M777 was generally used to fire small numbers of shells in support of troops. And they were also used by artillery units that would set up fire bases and they would stay there. In Ukraine, you cannot do that. You have to fire and then pack up your howitzer and leave, because now Russian counter-battery radar knows where you are and they're going to fire on your position. So again, this is another issue that I have been talking about for months. Now finally the New York Times is admitting it. On the other hand, Russian artillery is designed to fire huge quantities of ammunition. They always have been. And if a Russian gun does break down, and that is definitely going to happen, their repair facilities are very close by. The only long-range precision guided weapon Ukraine really has is HIMARS, has a range of 70 kilometers. So all Russia has to do is place repair facilities just outside the range of HIMARS, and you have a distance of 70 kilometers there, and then another 70 kilometers back, versus Ukraine traveling 1,000 kilometers in each direction. A clear advantage for Russia. So does all of that sound like what SIPA said, Ukraine consistently beating whatever Russia's military can deploy? It really doesn't seem like that. And this is the Western media refuting this claim by this Western US government and arms industry funded think tank. And that's just artillery. How about a wider spectrum of metrics? Let's look at this article from the Washington Post. And I know I've gone over it before, but it is extremely indicative of what is actually happening in Ukraine versus what people wish was happening in Ukraine. And it says, well, it's titled, "Wounded Ukrainian Soldiers Reveal Steep Toll of Kherson Offensive." And of course, the Kherson Offensive, in a way, was successful because Russia decided to withdraw from the city. But that wasn't because they were outfought. It's because they didn't want to waste resources defending the city. They needed those troops elsewhere. Every time Ukraine pushed toward Kherson City, Russian forces outfought them. Hands down, and even the Western media admits it. And this is what the Western media, the Washington Post, said. "We lost 5 people for every one they did. Russians' Orlan drones exposed Ukrainian positions from more than a kilometer above their heads," they said, an altitude that meant they never heard the buzz of the aircraft tracking their movements. Russian tanks emerged from newly built cement fortifications to blast infantry with large caliber artillery, the wounded Ukrainian soldiers said. The vehicles would then shrink back beneath the concrete shelters, shielded from mortar and rocket fire. Counter-battery radar systems automatically detected and located Ukrainians who were targeting the Russians with projectiles, unleashing a barrage of artillery fire in response. Russian hacking tools hijacked the drones of Ukrainian operators who saw their aircraft drift away helplessly behind enemy lines. Does that sound like what SIPA was talking about? Ukraine consistently beating whatever Russia's military can deploy? No, obviously not. It was very clear that what SIPA was doing and what people repeating these claims are doing, they're pushing propaganda. They want to keep this going for as long as possible, to clinch as many long-term contracts as possible, to keep this entire conflict as profitable as possible. They don't care what happens to Ukraine, which is why in the SIPA article, again, they never mentioned Ukrainian losses. That never entered their mathematics. Now, let's talk about Ukrainian losses. SIPA won't talk about them, but I want to talk about them. I want to show you how bad things are for Ukraine. And again, based on reports coming out of the Western media. I want to show you this video. I'm not going to play it, but the link will be in the video description below. It's from Forces News. Ukrainian soldiers put through their paces on UK-led crash course. And the report says, since June, the British Army and its international colleagues have overseen the training of 7,000 Ukrainians across 4 sites in the UK. The recruits are flown and kitted out with everything a soldier needs and put through their paces in a condensed version of what would ordinarily take a British recruit 6 months to achieve. At the end, they go home to Ukraine and they fight. So they're admitting that in half a year, they trained 7,000 Ukrainians. And in my last update about Ukraine, I talked about the US Department of Defense claiming that the UK would train 19,000 Ukrainian troops next year. And I wondered whether they meant for the entire year or that's just the first of many batches they plan on training. And when we look at this 7,000 in just half a year, it really seems like 19,000 is the maximum that the UK will be able to train next year. And if Ukraine itself admits they're losing 200 to 300 troops per day, that means 6,000 to 9,000 a month. Then that means the troops that the UK are training, they'll be gone in 2 months. What do they plan on doing for the rest of the year? They don't say. And what is the quality of this training? Okay, so UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace was talking during this video report, and he was claiming about Russia challenging our values, whatever that means, and how the UK is going to show these Ukrainians how they do things, you know, like lose in Afghanistan and lose in southern Iraq in Basra, because that's all I can remember the British doing recently. The video also says we're taking really raw recruits. Ukrainians literally get off the plane in tracksuits. We give them uniforms and take them through the basic training straight into skills, and some of them will go straight to the battlefield. So you're taking they're admitting these are totally raw recruits. This is not like the 300,000 Russia just mobilized. Those are reservists with previous military training. They're taking people with no military training and they're rushing them through this crash course for 5 weeks when it should actually take 6 months. And then they're throwing them right into combat, actual frontline combat. And so what the UK is actually doing is sending these men deliberately, knowingly to their death, to defeat and death. The UK training 7,000 in 6 months and not even coming close to training enough just to replace the number of soldiers Russia is removing from the battlefield in even a single month, a month or two. Russia is saying that they are in Ukraine to demilitarize its military. And that is exactly what they're doing. And if that wasn't true, then why would the UK be doing this? Why would you subject Ukrainian raw recruits to subpar training that you know is not enough to prepare them for the battlefield? Why wouldn't you train them properly? Why wouldn't you put them through a full 6-month course? Because Russia is killing Ukrainian troops so quickly, they couldn't even come close to affording to do that. What their goal right now at this point is to prolong the conflict for as long as possible. There's absolutely no way you're going to win if this is how many troops you're losing versus how many troops you're training. It's simply not going to happen. And this is absolutely criminal what the UK is doing. But then again, it's nothing new, is it? Now I want to get back to this SIPA article. And I want to talk about how they claim the U.S. and their allies, you know, they have a larger collective GDP. They have a much more massive military budget than Russia, and how they're going to outspend Russia. And, you know, outspending Russia, that's really great for SIPA sponsors like Lockheed and BAE. And we've also heard U.S. General Mark Milley talking about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. Let's look at this article here from Reuters. U.S. to support Ukraine for as long as it takes against Russia. Pentagon. It says, Ukraine will continue to endure. Ukraine is not going to back down, said Army General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, adding Ukraine was free and they want to remain free. Milley and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin both said the United States would support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And all of this talk all shares a common denominator. It is absolutely empty rhetoric, unmoored from reality, from facts, and it's also all things that we've heard before. So let's take a look at this article here. And you tell me if this sounds familiar. Now this is from back in 2010, UK to stay in Afghanistan as long as it takes. They're very unimaginative. They just use literally the exact same line over and over again. And this article from 2010 says British troops will stay in Afghanistan for as long as it takes. The new head of the British Armed Forces said in an interview published on Monday, suggesting 1,000 British trainers could stay beyond 2015. And they talk about General David Richards, who at the time was the British chief of the defense staff. And he was quoted by Reuters. The article said, "We really mean it when we say we will be there as long as it takes. It's so important that we establish in the minds of the Afghan people and of those in the region that NATO is not going to cut and run in Afghanistan," he said. And then what did they do? They cut and run. That is what they did. And we've also heard this in regards to South Vietnam. And Alexander McCurris of the Duran has been talking a lot lately about the similarities between what the US is doing in Ukraine and what the US was doing in South Vietnam. And he's absolutely correct. There are a lot of parallels. And then, of course, there's a lot of parallels with what the US and its allies were doing in Afghanistan. Now, the US, the UK, they cut and ran from Afghanistan. Now, you tell me, who had a bigger GDP, the US and the UK together, combined, or Afghanistan? And who had a bigger defense budget, the United States and the UK or Afghanistan? How big was the Afghan defense budget? And yet, the United States and the UK cut and run. So SIPA, citing this as some sort of relevant metric, is utterly irrelevant. There's obviously a lot more to analyzing these conflicts than just comparing GDPs and military budgets, obviously, or else the Vietnam War would have turned out totally different. The war in Iraq would have turned out completely different. The war in Afghanistan would have turned out completely different. The conflict in Syria would be going very differently if this was an actual metric that actually made a difference. So let me end it this way by asking a question. Do you really think that this time, when the US says they're going to be in Ukraine for as long as it takes, this will be the first time in US history that they really stick it out for as long as it takes, and Ukraine will prevail? Do you actually think that? Or do you think this is going to be another instance of the US using up a proxy until there's nothing left to use and then throwing them under the bus? Only time will tell, but I think we could all see where this is going. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my YouTube videos are automatically uploaded to Rumble and Odyssey. Might take a day or two, but they'll show up eventually. Subtitles on my YouTube videos are automatically generated. That might take a day or two to show up, but they will. And thank you for your patience. In the video description, there are also all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If you see an ad, please skip it. It's not helping me at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also through PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. That is what makes this work possible. And as always, thank you for watching.